right. So I'm Megan Jones. I'm the curator of the Sonoma County Wine Library. And the idea of a wine library, I know sounds quite odd. I get all sorts of reactions from people when I tell them that I work at the wine library or that we have a wine library in Sonoma County. So I'm going to start the presentation by just giving some context into the history of the wine industry in Northern California and the other wine libraries that we have, so that I think it will help kind of explain how a wine library came to be and why we have the collections that we do and the users that we serve. So here is a brief, very brief timeline of Sonoma County wine history. So, well, these dates also reflect the development of grape growing and winemaking in Napa County. The interesting thing about the wine industry is that prior to Prohibition, it was actually very well established. As you can see from the dates there were decades when there were a huge number of grape growers and wineries that existed, and Prohibition halted all of that progress. So in many cases, vineyards were torn out and new crops were planted, and the recovery of the wine industry took quite a long time after Prohibition. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was wine being made, but a lot of it was jug wines, very cheap wines. And at that time, if you wanted to serve a good bottle of wine, you bought French wine. So it wasn't until the 1960s that there started to be movement to create fine wines in Northern California. The date that most people point to as being a turning point was the Paris tasting. So I've included that. The 1976 Judgment of Paris was the tasting where French judges blind tasted French and American wines took the top honors. So the two wineries that won were Napa wineries, but of course, I have to say that the grapes that were used in the winning Chardonnay were grown in Sonoma County. So that tasting provided the international recognition that Northern California wines could compete with the best French fine wines. The last date I have here on the timeline is that our first AVA was established in 1981. AVAs are American viticultural areas, and the process is that an application is submitted to the federal government that designates certain geographical areas as being distinct in the wine that it produces in contrast to other areas. The AVA system is patterned off of the French AOP classification system. And the result is that AVA system gives greater distinction to wine so that you can see, you know, only 40 years ago is when we started establishing AVAs in Sonoma County. So the wine libraries that we have in Northern California, we have 3 of them. So we have UC Davis, the Napa Valley Wine Library, and the Sonoma County Wine Library. And this order is both the chronology that they were established and conveniently the east to west. If you go along Highway 128, you'll hit basically all of our wine libraries. So starting with UC Davis, UC Davis is the center of wine knowledge for our local industry. The library is arguably referred to as the world's greatest wine library. Their research, the work that they do at UC Davis, is what has allowed the industry to thrive. At this point, UC Davis, I feel kind of like San Jose State, has educated generations of grape growers and winemakers, and there's a huge community just of people who have gone through the same education process working in Sonoma and Napa counties. So I am going to read a quote that is a bit long, but I think it sums up the whole idea behind the UC Davis Viticulture and Enology program. On April 15th, 1880, the California legislature mandated the regents of the University of California to establish a program providing for instruction and research in viticulture and enology. The leaders in business and state government at the time realized that California had the potential to become one of the world's foremost wine and grape producing regions. They also recognized the establishment of a premier research and educational institution as a critical ingredient in the recipe for economic success. So back to 1880, UC Davis had this role. Their current department was established in 1935 after the end of Prohibition. And UC Davis has a very strong connection with Napa County grape growing. Back to about, I think it was in the 1930s and 1940s, they acquired 2 research vineyards. And to this day, UC Davis does research at those vineyards and has a research facility located at the Oakville Station, is the name of the facility. So there was this work being done by UC Davis and Napa already. And the next step is the Napa Wine Library. I do want to point out that I have included here a link if you want to know more about the UC Davis Wine Library collection. Axel Borg is the recently retired librarian of that collection, and he very recently did this interview where he talks about the library, and it's a great interview. If you want to check out what UC Davis has. So, the Napa Valley Wine Library in St. Helena. In 1963, industry members in Napa created the Wine Library Association. Their goal was to provide resources that would support the industry and allow them to make better wines. This is what the current wine library looks like. It was constructed in 1979. The collection actually had already been donated, so they constructed this building with a place in mind for the wine library collection. And I know that I could have found a better image of the interior of the wine library, but I found this photo of Elsie the library cat with the Napa Valley Wine Library behind her, so I had to include Elsie. She is a minor celebrity. All right, so I am going to talk about the Sonoma Wine Library. Would this be a good time to break for any questions on the previous slide?
Thank you. Yes, Amber has a question. Are these libraries open to the public?
Yes. So the Napa Wine Library is open any hours that the library is open. They're unfortunately, it's a small branch, so they have limited staff, but their technical services librarian is the person who has the most knowledge of the wine library collection there. And it's also kind of convenient because the St. Helena Historical Society is located in the public library. So there is also that whole other department of local history materials that's located at that library. The UC Davis Library is open to the public. It is a little bit harder to access because a lot of their material is in storage either offsite entirely, and they have to get it from Richmond, or in storage in such a way that you have to let them know ahead of time that you're coming to view the materials. But the library is open to anyone for research questions. They're not limited to UC Davis students. Alrighty. So this is a map of the AVAs in Napa and Sonoma counties. I wanted to include the AVAs on the map because you can see where St. Helena and Healdsburg are located in relation to the grape growing areas. St. Helena has a benefit in that Napa Valley has a more concentrated grape growing area. So St. Helena is fairly centrally located. In Healdsburg, we are straddling this huge amount of space, and we are quite far away from like the Sonoma Valley AVA, all of the growing that's happening on Sonoma Coast. So just to give you an idea of where all of our grape growing regions are. So following the same pattern as Napa, in the early 1970s, wine industry members in Sonoma County decided that they wanted a wine library as well, to support the growing wine industry. So the name of our organization was the Wine Library Associates of Sonoma County. And they fundraised for about 15 years before the building was finally built. They did a huge number of fundraisers, and all the while they were collecting materials. Healdsburg is close to grape growing regions, but part of the reason why it was picked as the location for the wine library was simply that the city of Healdsburg had plans to build a new building. So the Wine Library Associates were able to advocate to get their foot in the door and get the wine library planned into the design process. So the new building in Healdsburg with the public library and the wine library collection opened in the fall of 1988. There's the architectural drawing of it. So the Sonoma County Wine Library is overseen by me. I'm the only full-time staff person that's solely dedicated to the wine library. And my manager is the Healdsburg branch manager. We have about roughly 1,500 square feet for the collections, and we have tables and seating, and that's where my desk is located. And we operate under the same hours as the Healdsburg branch. So anytime that the library is open, you can access the wine library collection, except not right now because we are closed to the public and only doing curbside pickup. Would this be another good time for questions?
Yeah, there are a few questions in the chat about other wine libraries. Are there wine libraries in other states, or are they centralized in the wine country of California? Or are there other wine libraries in California, like Santa Ynez?
Yes, there are other wine libraries in California. Fresno State is the one that has a very well-established wine collection because they also focus on raisins and table grapes. And so there's Fresno State. Cal Poly Pomona has a pretty strong archival collection. I'm not sure what resources they have for science and current things, but I know they have a good history of materials on the wine and just on the wine history in that area. And then UC Santa Barbara is just starting to build up a wine collection. Within the last couple of years, they've started adding to that. There are other wine libraries, but the only one that I can think of that's pretty prominent is the Cornell on the East Coast. From what I understand from Axel Borg at UC Davis, is that Davis is fairly unique in that they try to collect internationally. They, if you're looking at wine libraries in France or other places, they're probably more limited in scope than what UC Davis is trying to do.
Danielle is wondering, what sorts of things do researchers search for at these libraries?
Yeah, everything. They were originally established for the science, the troubleshooting, grape growing, and winemaking, and trying to get the best information to make the best wine. But there's also a huge just student population that needs to use our materials for their studies. In Santa Rosa JC and Sonoma State, there are a couple of different courses in grape growing, winemaking, and wine business. So the students alone have a lot of research that they have to do for their assignments. And then wine is a popular industry. So we have a lot of people all the time who are writing articles, doing research for books. And of course, a whole chunk of people who do local history, who are trying to figure out that they have these vines on their property, when were they planted, who planted them, all sorts of fun research questions like that too.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Alrighty. So I included this photo of the interior of the wine library. This is Bo Simons. He was the original wine librarian for more than 20 years. He started in the 80s, and then this photo is from 2011 when he was promoted to branch manager and stopped being the wine librarian. So I'll go into the county system. So the Sonoma County Library has 14 locations. We serve 495,000 residents. In 1975 was when the Joint Powers Agreement was created that united all of the separate city public libraries into one system. So included in all of our locations, we have 4 special collections. So I don't think that this is rare for public libraries to have special collections nowadays, but I do think that we have kind of a lot for the size of system that we have. So the 4 special collections are Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library, the Sonoma County Archives. Those 2 are in standalone buildings. Although the archives is not open to the public, it's only a storage facility that's overseen by history and genealogy staff. And then the Petaluma History Room and the Wine Library are located inside the public library branches. So these special collections all have unique collecting goals, but we benefit from having each other in the system because we're all supported by the same departments. So we are lucky enough to be in buildings that are maintained by the same facility staff. All of our technology is provided by the same IT department. But it's really the collection services department that provides us with the most support. In addition to all of the acquisitions and cataloging that they do for the entire system, they support us in processing our special collections, our historical materials. They, of course, obviously do the acquisitions and cataloging side of things, but then they help us on preservation issues. They help us with digitization projects, and sending things to the bindery and enclosing our materials so that they're best preserved. So there are some negatives to being in a public library system. I think that the largest issue is security, both in terms of if we are in a separate facility, we would have less people coming in and out. It would be more secure in that way, but mainly in terms of temperature and humidity and trying to best preserve the materials. So at the wine library, we have windows and doors. We have fresh air that's coming in all the time. It's always more warm than it should be. So that's the huge negative. Being in a public library, we have security and preservation issues, but we also have a huge amount of support from the rest of the system. Are there any more questions?
How do you handle those variables being in a public library with the special collection? How do you manage that?
Not terribly well. We have done our best to move stuff that is really truly fragile out of the area and digitize things that are also fragile. So for example, we have our rare books collection. The rare books go back, they're mainly from the 18 and 1900s, but we do have some that are from the 1500s and are, in between there. And they are not in the best heat or humidity level, but we have done a digitization project where I think the majority of those published before 1920 have been digitized now. So at least we have a digital version of those. Same with, like, we had film reels that were in our collection. Those we sent away to digitize because the film reels would not, it's amazing that they still survived because that's not a great location for them. And there is kind of a hope that we can eventually create a better storage facility for the Sonoma County archives, and that there would be room when we move those into a new facility to store some of our photos and things that we would rather get out of the public libraries. Because it's the same issue at the Petaluma History Room. The History and Genealogy Library is the only library that has rooms within the library that they can set to colder temperatures and that are secured by card entry and stuff like that.
I have a couple more questions. Heather, did that answer your question? She was wondering if you tried to create an enclosed or AC regulated space for researchers and materials. Okay, great. Thank you.
Taylor, right above Heather, had a question too.
Yes. Taylor says, I'm doing a research project on information seeking behaviors of wine enthusiasts. Are patrons of wine libraries mostly professionals and academic researchers? And how do wine libraries serve wine enthusiasts within the general public?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that those are the majority of our users. We are fairly split between students, industry members, wine aficionados, and researchers. It's right now, because we're closed, I get more questions from researchers than I do from students. Like, student questions have dropped off a lot. But we do have a fair amount of just people who are interested in wine. And what I get a lot of questions on from people who are interested in wine is either tasting or travel. So we have local people, and because we're in a public library, people can request books from across the system. So it's not just Healdsburg residents that are coming in and checking things out. It's people requesting books to get sent to Rincon Valley or Sonoma Valley. And so a lot of people are interested in just educating themselves on tasting wines. That's also kind of a common thing. I think that people locally will just take junior college classes and other courses to familiarize themselves. And then tourism all the time, because people who are interested in visiting the local wine industry when they travel places, they want to visit the wine industry in other countries. So we have a lot of people who do research on French, Spanish, Australian wines because they're preparing to travel, which is kind of funny because those aren't really the materials that are used by industry members, occasionally students or researchers, but there's a huge use in them with just the public.
We have a couple more questions in the chat. Do you want to answer them now, or do you want to wait until the next slide?
I think this is a good time.
Okay, great. So Jade asks, are these resources also digitized?
Some of them. We have a lot of things that we still need to digitize. We are fairly behind. So for example, in our photo collection, we have about, I think, 500 photos that have been digitized, and there are easily another 2,000 that we could digitize. So for the local history, a lot of times people just have to come through us. We do have people find our materials on Calisphere and on our digital collection site, but most of the materials, they have to reach out to librarians, and we can scan stuff. They don't have to come into the library, but we have a lot more that needs to be digitized.
And Monica asks, my dream is to work for a wine library. I applied for a wine librarian position in Napa, but sadly did not get the job. I have a bachelor's degree in travel industry management, an MLIS degree, and now I'm working on a second master's degree in archives and records administration. Do you have any suggestions for how I could improve my knowledge to be a more perfect fit for this type of position?
I did find that when I applied for this job, I needed to know a lot more about wine. I know that I came in with a fairly good knowledge of wine because my dad was in the industry. And so I grew up knowing about wine and being the children that have to go to the tasting room while the adults are doing a wine tasting. But as much as I knew about wine from just exposure, there was a lot more that I had to learn when I started this job. I feel like a solid, like the first year that I was doing this, I was reading all the time to just catch up with what's going on in the industry and all sorts of terms that there would be no reason to know about the, fermentation process. And when people come to you and ask, like, I'm looking for books on stuck fermentation, it is a whole other thing to be searching for technical terms like that than just knowing, what varieties there are and what we grow locally. So I think that learning as much about the local wines and the wine industry and the technology and the science behind viticulture and enology was something that I needed when I started this position.
And Catherine asks, what is the most challenging part of being a wine librarian? The most exciting? How is it different from being any other kind of librarian?
The most challenging thing is easily time management. I have huge collection projects that I could spend all day, every day doing just projects with the collection, but I can't because we are in a public library system where we're answering the phone, we're answering emails, we have all sorts of just public library information that you have to keep up with. Like we just transitioned to a new e-print software. So we had to learn about how to release print jobs for people on that whole other platform. So the hardest part is trying to balance the long-term collections projects with the day-to-day questions that have to be answered. And it's been difficult in the pandemic because we've been short-staffed. So I've spent even more time on the reference side of the public library and less time on the wine library collection. But hopefully we'll be able to finish some of those before we open to the public.
Amy wants to know about sommeliers. Are they among your researchers, industry members studying for the exams?
Yes, I do get people who are studying for that exam and also the WSET, which is a European Wine Spirits Education Trust system. And I don't know that I get a lot of people who have been in the industry for a long time, but I do get a lot of people who are new to the industry who have started jobs in tasting rooms or something like that, and they're trying to transition into being a sommelier. So there are actually some textbooks and things for sommelier exams and journals. So we have those at the wine library.
And there are multiple levels, right, to the exam?
Yes.
Up to 4. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I actually have never seen the Somm documentary series, which is super popular. But
yes.
also watch that.
Catherine wants to know, what's the best way to learn more about wines and wine pairings?
I like the super basic text sites like Wine Folly, where they just keep everything simple, because if you try to go into the details of the differences between Chardonnay grapes in all of the different regions just in California and then looking at the world, it becomes a huge, huge process. So I like to start with the really basic sites like Wine Folly that give you just the top level of pairing information. And then after that, it's really easy to delve down into more details. There are a lot of excellent online magazines for wine, sites like 750 Daily and Punch magazine that write amazing in-depth articles on just a specific varietal. So I find it's pretty easy to go down to that next level of information if you're looking for it.
Great, thank you. Those are the questions for now. So I guess we'll continue, and anybody who wants to drop your questions into the chat box, feel free to do so as we commence. Thank you.
All right. So our digital collections. I wanted to include this just kind of as an add-on to the idea of us being supported by the same departments in the library system. This sort of project would not be possible if we didn't have one IT and cataloging department driving the project. So the digital collection site is where we have all of our digitized materials, both that the library has taken on individually. So we have things like the wine library photographs, but then also our collections have done different partnerships. So we have collections in here that were done where the collections might be owned by a different historical society, but because they partnered with the library to digitize them, we have them available on the site. So the excellent thing about it too is instead of I'm only searching in the wine library collection, when you search in this, you're pulling from all of those historical resources to get whatever we have. Being in a public library system, it also helps because I am the only person for the wine library. And when I worked at the Napa County Historical Society, I was the only librarian, and just trying to staff the desk ends up being a problem in itself. So being located in the public library is excellent because we have staff members who can be there running the library, and I don't have to be there. It allows people to be there 6 days a week asking questions because the other reference staff can send people to resources. And then when we do programs, it gives us all sorts of benefits to have other staff members working and helping us work the programs. So before I go a little bit more into the collection, I just wanted to throw these statistics up here to show how important the wine industry is to Napa and Sonoma counties. We have, in 2019, the wine grape crop in Napa was $938 million, and in Sonoma, $630 million. And that is just the value of the crop. That's just the grapes sold. That does not even touch whatever the total wine sales were. And the amount that visitors spent, unfortunately, of course, I'm sure that this number has dipped because we had fires and the pandemic in the last 2 years, but you can see the huge impact that the industry still has on our local economies. Okay, so the wine library collection, we split into circulating and non-circulating. The circulating materials are the ones where we are still collecting on an international level. We don't keep things though as long as we used to. So the initial goal of the wine library going back to the 1970s and 80s was that they were trying to create a fine wine destination. And so this involved a huge amount of research on what people everywhere in the world had already done. So they needed as much information as possible, and they kept it for as long as possible. Now, of course, information has changed, and we are in an age where the internet is not only providing better resources than there are in print in a more timely manner, some of the best resources online never end up making it into print. So we have pivoted a little bit. Our circulating collection, we still keep, but we don't put our efforts into preserving that collection the way we did in the 80s or 90s. Now we put our preservation efforts into the non-circulating collection. And the materials in those collections are the ones that we try to focus on the local wine industry. We do, the Sonoma County Library is in a partnership with Lake and Mendocino counties. So we do have some materials from Lake and Mendocino, but the majority of our stuff is just Sonoma County photos, posters, bottles, labels that we are trying to preserve to give a snapshot of the local wine industry. We feel like UC Davis, as much information as they have, they're not going to try to be capturing that same local history. So that's our main goal with our non-circulating collection. So here's some more information about our local history. A couple of photos there of our maps and bottles. Yeah. So I think that the benefit that we have with this collection is really in preserving the roots of the wine industry. The wine industry has a bit of a problem with turnover. There's constant acquisitions, changing of winery names, and the history gets lost really quickly. So we are doing our best to try to keep up with what's happening in the local wine industry and add these sorts of materials when wineries go out of business, so that we have that preserved. So we have the physical items like the bottles and the photos. The ephemera files are a huge benefit. They started this project as soon as the library opened. Actually, the ephemera files were started even earlier than that because they had them at the History and Genealogy Library, and then they sent us the wine files. So I think that those files date back to the 1960s in some cases. And we get donations from people like publicity relations businesses, tour guides, of just their backlog of things that they acquired for local wineries. So pamphlets, newsletters, maps, postcards, all sorts of information about wineries and individual people and other wine-related businesses that we've been preserving in these files. So none of those are digitized. They are a huge collection.
There are a few questions in the chat.
Rosemary asked a question earlier, and I'm sorry I did not get to it, but she wondered, do you consider yourself an archivist?
I do. And our history and genealogy librarians actually refer to themselves as archivists in the way they sign off on things. That was my focus when I was in library school. And although I consider myself an archivist, there's a huge chunk of my time is just normal public library work. So it is very split between the two because I'm still adding new books and magazines and processing that side of the collection.
Lizette wants to know, would you consider allowing volunteers to help you with the long-term projects of the wine library's collection or taking interns?
Yes, I normally have an excellent group of volunteers that I have not seen in a year now. I have about 5 volunteers normally who work on long-term projects, and these things listed here are exactly the projects that they work on. I had one volunteer who was working on bottles, another on labels, another on maps, and 2 working on the ephemera files. So they help me do the long work of both indexing things and organizing them. And since we've been on kind of a weeding project in trying to pull out things that aren't Sonoma County history and donate them to other organizations, they've been helping me identify those materials as well. We have never had an intern, but we do have volunteers.
Is there a place that people can contact the library if they're interested in doing something like that?
Yeah, I think that we have like just a general form for volunteers on the website. We probably don't have it live right now because we haven't been taking any new volunteers, but normally there is a general form for volunteers that includes if you have a special interest in genealogy or any of the other special collections. The volunteers that I have, some of them are connected to the wine industry, like they've retired and they formerly worked in that industry, but a lot of them are just locals who had a profession that is well suited to this sort of work. And aren't actually that familiar with the wine industry, but like to do the research and like to know more about them.
Christina wants to know, is there a long-term preservation plan to relocate all of the materials sensitive to temperature and humidity offsite to an archival vault and point all researchers to the digital surrogates?
There is not a long-term plan in that we are still trying to figure out what to do with the archives. The archives were a problem that were supposed to be solved last year was when the lease was originally up on the building. If you have noticed the fires we've had in the last few years, in 2020 and in 2017, we had fires that came very close to where the archives are located. The fire that just happened this past November was actually, the fire was on the same campus that the archives are located in and was stopped like 500 feet away from the building. So all of the long-term planning in preserving materials is focused on the archive right now. Most of my materials are not that old. The majority of the stuff I have is on the more modern wine industry. So those materials take priority because those are the county materials that go back to about the 1850s. So hopefully they will be able to come up with a long-term storage solution to the archives, and then we can work on a plan to get our materials out. But there is, of course, a long-term plan for digitization. We have a whole idea of what we want to tackle in what order, but that has been kind of put on hold due to budget cuts to the pandemic.
And Andrea wants to know, I'm sure relevant to everyone attending this presentation from SJSU, as a special and public librarian, which MLIS classes helped you the most when you were at SJSU? Which classes would you recommend?
I liked the general just searching and database classes. I have to say that I feel like the classes that focused on archives, I learned more in doing an internship than I did in the classes, although the classes were helpful. It was kind of the general, I feel like I learned working with historical materials in practice, and the classes that helped me were the ones that I had no experience with when I came into the job. I very much should have taken more classes on cataloging, which I avoided because I didn't think that I would need as much. And databases and searching were the ones that I feel like I've used a lot in this job.
Okay, a couple more questions from Christopher. How does working for a library compare to working for a historical society?
I like the freedom that I had at the Historical Society. There is a lot more bureaucracy in the library, but I don't think that you can replace the security that the library provides. The library has a stable source of funding, and the Historical Society is based on donations. So when I worked for the Historical Society, it was right after the Napa earthquake, and that earthquake had a huge impact on our funds in that we had to do repairs to the building. So we had to finance moving out of the building so the repairs could be done. It was a very long process, and the whole time we were closed, we didn't have foot traffic coming in, people seeing the exhibits and donating to the Historical Society. So the Historical Society was great in the variety of stuff that I was able to do all of the time, but the public library has the resources that I feel like we need to make the collections available to the public. And hopefully in a long-term way, keep them safe.
I had a quick question in regards to marketing. How much time do you spend marketing? What kind of events do you focus on?
Yeah, we have marketing takes up a lot of time. We have a Facebook and Instagram account that the Facebook account is just the wine library, and I'm not very good at posting to it. The Instagram is all of our special collections, and that one's a little bit better because we're sharing the load on people post on different days. When we do marketing for wine library events, I'm actually pretty spoiled because they're, due to our Friends organization having existed for the last 50 years, they already have a very strong following. So when we were doing wine library events, we definitely push them out to the public, but they are also being marketed to the people who follow the Friends of the Wine Library. And that's already a built-in audience that's interested in our events.
So it sounds like collaboration is very important.
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Does anyone have any other questions?
There's one more from Daniela. She says, I'm doing a group project making a wine database for restaurateurs. What would you consider important when indexing, and is cataloging done in-house or by others at Sonoma County? Speaking of cataloging.
So our cataloging is mainly done by the cataloging department, but there are certain projects that they really don't have the time to do that they have trained the special collections librarians how to catalog materials. So, for example, when we have archival collections that need to be cataloged, things like personal papers and photos and slides, there's a lot of work that we can do on doing a rough catalog of them, which is normally our goal, to get them loosely into our databases instead of trying to send them to our cataloging department to exhaustively catalog them with full metadata and everything. So for a database for restaurateurs, I think that it would be kind of interesting to organize that based on pairing recommendations and on features of wine, because I feel like a lot of questions that people have nowadays are about, is the wine natural or biodynamic? Was the winemaker a woman, or is it a family-owned winery? I think that those questions or categories would be interesting in a database of wines.
Excellent, thank you. We'll continue, and again, if anybody has questions, just keep entering them into the chat box. Thank you.
Alrighty. So here I just wanted to show our Wine Library Associates of Sonoma County that was eventually renamed the Friends of the Sonoma County Wine Library. This is our nonprofit that's been supporting us all this time. And Friends of Libraries are common organizations, but I feel like the fact that our organization has existed for so much longer than the actual library is kind of unique. So Millie Howie was publicity relations. She had a business where she marketed wineries, and her donation to the collection ended up being incredible because wineries sent her materials all the time that she saved and donated to us. So we have a huge number of materials on wineries that are from her. Julie Pedroncelli St. John is the current president of the Friends organization. Julie's been the president for as long as I've been the wine librarian, so it's amazing to work with them. And so our nonprofit does fundraising, and I think this is pretty standard for public libraries. They'll do fundraising, and then periodically we ask them for help on either buying new books if our book budget is a little small one year, or if there's particular materials that we want to add that are more expensive, and in special projects. So one thing that we're looking at right now is hopefully doing kind of a refresh of the library, not a renovation where we would be tackling the structure of the building, but an interior changing of walls, floors, furniture. So it will probably be a couple of years down the line, but the Friends are an organization that will help us fundraise and then, you know, add to what the what the library system sets aside for that project. So in the wine library, all of our shelves are wood instead of metal. And that's because when we opened in the 1980s, the Friends, the Wine Library Associates at that time, donated the money to give us nicer shelves. So this is our support organization. and users of the wine library. I covered this a little bit earlier, but it is mainly those 4 groups: industry members, students, researchers or writers, and locals who are interested in the local industry or in traveling. We have, I will put under the researchers and writers category anyone who's doing research but is not a researcher. So, for example, a question we just had recently was a winemaker who buys grapes from 2 vineyards that were planted in 1925 and 1939 and makes wine from them. And he was hoping that we could find more information about who planted those vines, and I think kind of confirm those dates, so that he could include more of that information when he sells the wine. So I group those sorts of questions under research, because the questions that we get from wine industry members tend to be more straightforward questions about resources for tasting, pairing, pest control, all of the grape growing and winemaking technical questions. This photo is of Martha Bannister and Marianne Graff. This is a photo in our collection. They were groundbreaking researchers on the science of wine and wine analysis, and both were supporters of the wine library. And programs. So our programs, we try to do one every other month or so. That, of course, is totally on hold. We've only done one virtual program since we've been closed down. But the programs are a great opportunity to give back to the community, to show them basically like a manifestation of the work that the wine library is doing in these programs. So this is still from, we did a presentation of visual history. So I don't think I've talked about that at all, but one of the early collections that the Wine Library Associates focused on was oral histories. They both acquired and paid for oral histories to be done with industry members. So that project was very strong all the way from the 1980s through the early 2010s. And our current Friends group has kind of revived it as a video project. So they have done video interviews with local wine industry people, and then we are able to show them at the library. And normally we have the person who's in the video and or their family there to answer questions on the night as well. So this is with Helen Bacigalupi last year. And I think that's it for my presentation slides.
Thank you so much, Megan. I do have one question on my end. When you're talking about your users, and they're coming into the industry, and maybe they're coming in from hospitality, from agriculture, from business, from kind of adjacent industries, does that affect how you communicate with them, or the materials you recommend, or the language that you use? Or how do you kind of pivot to people who are entering from different sectors?
Yeah, it is tricky, because sometimes I'll start a research question and think that they have a different knowledge level than they do, and then that's super awkward to have to backtrack and apologize because they know more than I thought they did. So it is a bit tricky, but I think it's the classic, is it the reference interview? Asking as many questions as possible. It's something that I get in trouble with all the time, as I take a question from someone and I don't follow up, and then have to come back to them almost immediately, like, oh no, I'm sorry, I need to ask you all of these follow-up questions to get what you're looking for. So yeah, there is definitely, depending on what they're familiar with, I would recommend different resources, print and online, if people are more comfortable. One thing that is super helpful are the journals, but the journals are difficult to access if you are not familiar with scientific journals. So that's something for sure that if people have experience using, it's easy to turn them onto those materials that I wouldn't just give to someone otherwise because they're so challenging to find relevant articles in.
Thank you. Taylor wants to know, does the wine library facilitate any outside events in the community?
So we, I think kind of the line there is that if there's something that involves a lot of partnership, we might ask for it to be a Friends event instead of a wine library event, because the Friends do events as a fundraising tool, and they are able to be more flexible on charging fees, paying for locations, you know, paying for other venues. So we have partnered people with events that are wine library events, but it's easier to partner with certain organizations if we're doing it as a Friends event. So for example, the Atlantic Seaboard Wine Association will come out to Sonoma County in January for a wine conference that happens. And we've done a tasting event with them where they lecture about East Coast wines, and then they provide tasting opportunities for all of the award-winning wines that they are bringing to the conference. So that is an event that takes place at the wine library, but we do it through the Friends because the Friends can better handle the process for pouring wines, getting the ABC license, charging for the wine tasting, where that is not in the realm of the public library because we wouldn't charge a fee for a program.
Is there a specific database that your library uses for wine specifically? The International Wine Database or something to that effect?
Yeah, so our International Wine Research Database is a project that was started, I think about 20 years ago. And it was basically the cataloging project for the articles that we have at the library. And we have stopped doing that collection because the cataloging of the articles on an item level was completely overwhelming. After there was kind of a long gap between the previous wine librarian and when I started. So we were already about 2 years behind on collecting articles. So that database is still there, but it's kind of a capsule database. It's looking at a specific time period of when those articles were published. The database that we use is the food, I'm not going to be able to remember the name. It's the food database, abstract database. I can't remember the name of that. But we also have like online access to the American Journal of Wine and other journals like that that we use when we're looking for articles.
So interesting. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Are there any other questions for Megan before we wrap up? For those of you who attended tonight, there's just a quick survey link, which we'll post to the chat box. You can also check out, again, the SLA Student Chapter website, which we'll post to the chat box as well. Megan, this was incredible and illuminating. Thank you so much. There's a lot of positivity streaming through the chat box right now. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us at SJSU and hopefully relive some of your fond memories of being a student here. But we really appreciate all your time and effort for tonight's event.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It was wonderful. Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Megan.